Hey everyone, welcome back. Last week we looked at Acts chapter 19, Paul persevering in the mission. Today we'll skip ahead a few chapters to Acts chapter 22 and chapter 23 as we look at Paul continuing through opposition. Paul will stand trial before the Sanhedrin as he proclaims the gospel in his defense. We see that God strengthens Paul, and we can learn how to face opposition and stand strong through difficult times. Before we get into our story today in Acts chapter 22 and 23, I think it's important that we kind of backtrack and cover Acts 19 and 20. You see, in Acts chapter 19, after Paul left Ephesus, he went to Troy and then to Macedonia, to the north and the west of Ephesus. From Macedonia, he traveled on to Greece and stayed there for a few months before going back to Macedonia in the city of Philippi. From Philippi, he took a ship to Troy, and from Troy, he took a ship to Miletus. He skipped Ephesus, which is a halfway point between Miletus and Troy, and instead he stayed at Miletus and invited the Ephesian elders to come visit him there. In Acts chapter 20, we read about the Ephesian elders visiting Paul in Miletus. We see this beautiful farewell at the end of Acts chapter 20 as Paul and the elders weep together and pray together as they depart this last time. Paul takes a ship in Acts chapter 20 from Miletus down to Syria and from Syria into Jerusalem. Here we pick up our story in Acts chapter 21 as Paul is in Jerusalem and he goes and visits the temple. And while he's visiting the temple, some Jews from the region of Asia, you remember that's the place where Ephesus is, the province where Ephesus is located. Some Jews from Ephesus noticed Paul there in Jerusalem. And in that moment, they recognized that he was the one who proclaimed Jesus from the way. They challenged him, they opposed him, they cursed him, and they called out that he was a Gentile lover, and he was a person who defamed and desecrated the temple. In doing so, they caused a significant riot in Jerusalem. And in that moment, Paul was caught in this riot by a bunch of God-fearing Jewish people. It was such a riot that the Romans came in and broke it up. And a Roman centurion grabbed Paul, pulled him out of the crowd, and took him off and imprisoned him. It's where we pick up our story today in Acts chapter 22, starting in verse 30. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. So here Paul was before the Sanhedrin, before the Jewish leaders, before the Jewish court. And he was explaining to them why he was in prison and why he was accused by these Jewish people from Ephesus of desecrating the temple. Here in Acts chapter 22, at the very end, Paul is now presenting his case before the Sanhedrin. In Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, we see that Paul begins to receive an unfair trial. So in Acts chapter 23, starting in verse 6, he hijacks the conversation. And this is what he said. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels or spirits, but the Pharisees believe all of these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued violently. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" Now there's a lot happening in these verses, but the big thing we see is that Paul stood in opposition because of the resurrection. That's really our first point today. He stood in opposition because of the resurrection. You see, Paul believed in the way. He believed in Jesus. He believed in the true gospel. Because of what he proclaimed in Ephesus for those 2 years and 3 months, people opposed him and people accepted him. Apparently, during the time of Paul's travels, when he went to Macedonia and to Greece, some of the Jews from Ephesus traveled to Jerusalem, possibly on business, maybe as a way to go visit family. But while they were at the temple, Paul returned to the Jerusalem temple, and they recognized him as the one who proclaimed the way, as the one who proclaimed Jesus, as the one who proclaimed the resurrection. Because of the kerfluffle that Paul caused there at the temple, the riot that he caused, the commander took him before the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling body. Now, the Sanhedrin were composed of a number of people from the Sadducees, from the Pharisees. The chief priest was there, the high priest was there, among a number of other Jewish teachers and scribes. It was an important body of men who debated the law, who debated and adjudicated court cases for the Jewish people. So the Romans had their courts, the Jews had their courts. And this commander, recognizing that Paul was a Jew and that the issue was a Jewish issue, took the people and Paul before the Sanhedrin to have the case adjudicated. Paul, recognizing that he wasn't receiving a fair trial, immediately jumped on the issue of the resurrection, knowing full well that the Pharisees believed in the resurrection and the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Michelle Lee Barnwell, in her great article, talks about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. We learn a lot about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, not only from Scripture, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also from a Jewish writer in the Roman period named Josephus. Now, Josephus wrote a couple of volumes, Antiquities and the Jewish Wars. In these two books, he writes about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And a few things we learn are these. The Pharisees were men who had the voice of the common man. They cared about the common person. And it seems that they had the voice of the masses on their side. We learn that the Pharisees believed that God had fated certain things, but that they also had to live a specific way. They believed in not only the written law, but also the oral traditions of the rabbis and the teachers. And these Pharisees were ones who wanted the people to live a very specific way. They wanted them to live rightly and morally based on the law of Moses, the law of Moses that God gave to Moses at Sinai. We see the Sadducees, on the other hand, according to Josephus, were those who were wealthy, and they had the ear of the rich people in the time. But not only that, we notice that the Sadducees did not believe in the angels, nor did they believe in the resurrection. This is important because the Sadducees recognized, or at least didn't believe, that fate was real, that God fated things. And so when people died, they died, their soul died, and there was nothing left. In many ways, it was like modern-day annihilationism. When a person dies, he or she just ceases to exist. The Sadducees believed that there was no resurrection of the body. We also know that the Sadducees, because they believed in the law and they believed in living a specific way, had more strict and stringent consequences for those who broke the law. Compared to the Pharisees, they were much more stringent in their application and consequences of those who broke the law. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees were two different groups of religious people in the time. The Pharisees had the ear of the common man, the Sadducees of the wealthy. The Pharisees believed in living a good life and living rightly before the Lord, the oral and the written tradition. The Sadducees believed in merely the written tradition. Pharisees believed in angels and the afterlife, and the Sadducees didn't. So Paul bringing up this issue of the resurrection was significant because we see that the Sadducees and the Pharisees began to fight among themselves. I bet this was an incredible scene of men going after each other over something as important as the resurrection, or in this case, it seems as silly as the resurrection, even though the resurrection is a significant issue. Because of this uproar, we see the commander who had taken Paul before the Sanhedrin decided to pull him away. And we see in pulling away that God protected and God was with Paul during this time. I want us to continue reading in verse 10. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. In verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." This is our second point, that God was with Paul and gave him strength to fight through the opposition. You see, after this interaction with the Sanhedrin, Paul was removed from that group and taken to jail, not because he was in trouble, but for his own protection. And there God appeared to Paul. And he said, "You spoke the truth about me in Jerusalem. And because of that, you are going to speak the truth about me everywhere else, specifically in Rome." These verses are a powerful reminder that even in the midst of difficulty, God is with his people. You see, God calls people to specific tasks. He calls them to live for him, not only in just everyday moral choices, but also as they proclaim the gospel to people around them. Paul was one who proclaimed the truth. God protected him despite the opposition he faced. I love the fact that God showed up. He appeared next to Paul. He stood next to Paul. And I can imagine he put his arm around Paul and he spoke directly to him. "I am with you. I am here. I am comforting you." How many of us who have children have done that with our children? When our children come home from school and they're devastated, brokenhearted about a friend who called them a name, or maybe there was a fight at school and they were kicked or punched. We find that when our children need comfort, we can be there and wrap our arms around them. The same is true with a spouse. Those of you who've been married or are married, you know that in moments of distress, it is so comforting to have arms wrapped around you. Feel the warmth of someone's body as they pull you close and say, "It's okay. It's okay." Here, Paul felt that same thing from God himself as Jesus came and put his arm and encouraged and comforted him. The Lord stood near Paul and spoke to him to have courage. Similar message was given to Joshua in Joshua 1:9. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." I think it's an important reminder for us to find strength and courage in the Lord who is with us, who has promised that he will never leave us nor forsake us. And as a parent or a spouse or a friend encourages us with deep affection and a warm embrace, God does the same. He does the same to Paul. He gives him strength despite opposition. Well, we see something incredible next. Like the scene out of a spy novel, Paul is wrapped up in the middle of a plot to kill him. Let's take a look in Acts chapter 23, starting in verse 12. "The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders," so that group that was a part of the Sanhedrin. "And they went and they said, 'We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we've killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about this case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there.' But when the son of Paul's sister, so his nephew, heard about this plot, he went to the barracks and he told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and he said, 'Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him.' So he took him to the commander. And the centurion said, 'Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this man to you because he has something to tell you.'" We see that the boy told the commander all about this plot to kill Paul. And in verse 22, the commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone what you've reported to me." In verse 23, then he called two of his centurions and he ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may take him safely to the governor Felix." We see that God provided protection through this commander, that Paul would be spared from this plot. You see, Paul in his prison was waiting to be tried before the Romans and before the Jews so that he could be released to continue on his mission. But God had other plans. God, he sovereignly intervened in this situation. The Jews wanted to kill Paul. They didn't want him anymore. They had been so riled up at Paul's promise and Paul's proclamation of the gospel and of Jesus and of the resurrection that they wanted to see Paul dead. So they plotted against him, and because of God's superintending intervention, his sovereign intervention, this young boy, this nephew of Paul, heard the plot, went and told Paul, who in turn told the commander, and heard the nephew's story. God's intervention in this story saved Paul's life. You know, it's incredible to realize that we also serve this same God. This God who spared Paul, who provided for Paul, who protected Paul, who intervened on Paul's behalf. This same God also is the God whom we serve. You and I serve the God of the universe, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of Paul, the God who spared Paul's life through a fateful circumstance, an overheard conversation, and a trustworthy messenger who shared that message with the commander in charge of Paul's prison. I love the story that Paul was spared. You see, Paul continued through opposition. He faced the Sanhedrin, and he got out of that. He faced jail time, and God was with him. And he faced a plot to assassinate him. And in that plot to assassinate him, God intervened to protect his life. You see, you and I serve an incredible God, a God who faces opposition for us, who stands in our way, who helps provide a path for us to share the gospel despite all of the things that we might face as opposition. You and I serve that great God. I would encourage us to go out this week, share the truth with those around us. Share the truth with people who need Jesus more than ever. Share the gospel, and even in the face of opposition, and I'm not talking about facing death, but facing people who refuse to hear, or who argue with you, or who disagree with you. When you face those people, keep pressing forward. Keep taking the gospel. Keep sharing the message of truth because it is worth sharing. And the God whom we serve is faithful to see us through sharing that message. I hope that that is true in your life. Let's take the message this week.